Beginning with Hippocrates, physicians have committed themselves to helping the sick and abstaining from whatever is harmful and mischievous. Yet under the dictatorship of Adolf Hitler, doctors recast themselves as murderers, claiming to serve the Volkskörper, or national body. In 1945, the Allies liberated the Nazi concentration camps, as well as many places classed as sanitariums or mental hospitals. The unimaginable horrors perpetrated by the Third Reich were revealed to the world. Worse yet, doctors had participated in some of the most gruesome atrocities. The medical profession had been among the most willing of Hitler's accomplices. In 1946, some of those doctors went on trial in Nuremberg for war crimes and crimes against humanity. One of them was Karl Brandt. Brandt's newly examined prison diaries reveal details of the path that ultimately led him to the centers of power, making him a familiar figure at Hitler's side as the Führer's personal physician. Karl Brandt originally dreamed of being a missionary doctor, like his idol, Albert Schweitzer. Yet he ended up at the Nuremberg medical trial, answering for crimes against humanity.
Ich werde einer solchen Anklage meinetwillen nicht ausweichen. Im großen Schwurgerichtssaal zu Nürnberg begann genau ein Jahr nach der Eröffnung des ersten großen Kriegsverbrecherprozesses die erste Verhandlung gegen 23 führende nationalsozialistische Ärzte. Das Militärtribunal besteht aus 4 amerikanischen Richtern. Den Vorsitz führt Oberrichter Biels. Zahlreiche deutsche Zuhörer waren zu der Verhandlung zugelassen.
The United States of America versus Karl Brandt et al. That might sound like arbitrary victor's justice, but the court assures us that this will not simply be an act of revenge. Justice shall prevail. There were 4 charges in the indictment at the Nuremberg medical trial, including war crimes and crimes against humanity, a part of which were medical experiments on human subjects and the so-called euthanasia program, the murder of hundreds of thousands of institutionalized patients.
Jeder Angeklagte wird von Oberrichter Biels einzeln aufgerufen und gefragt, ob er sich schuldig oder nicht schuldig erklärt. Karl Brandt, der frühere Leibarzt Adolf Hitlers, Generalleutnant der Waffen-SS und Reichskommissar für das Sanitäts- und Gesundheitswesen.
Against you, guilty or not guilty? Nicht schuldig.
Prison in November 1946. The main war criminals had barely been hanged when new defendants were moved in. The doctors and medical functionaries were closely guarded by GIs to prevent anyone from evading trial by committing suicide, as Hermann Goering had done. The main defendant, Dr. Karl Brandt, planned his defense in cell 373, and he wrote a diary. It was very personal and intended only for his family. We can now read it for the first time. Will his diary tell us more about his motives than could be learned from the trial record? Because his actions and those of his physician colleagues seem unfathomable. The court and the international public learn about them through Nuremberg's chief prosecutor, Brigadier General Telford Taylor.
The defendants and the doctor charged with murder. But this is no mere murder trial. The mere punishment of the defendants, or even of thousands of others equally guilty, can never redress the terrible injuries which the Nazis visited on these unfortunate peoples. It is our deep obligation to all peoples of the world to show why and how these things happened.
In searching for the why and how, we have to go back to the beginning. On January 30th, 1933, Hitler and his National Socialist Party, the NSDAP, took over the government, overwhelmingly cheered on by the German people. Citizens didn't waste any time rallying behind the new government. Nor did Germany's doctors want to be left out. Their motto became, "Work for the Führer." The doctors sent a congratulatory telegram to Adolf Hitler, the new Chancellor of the Reich.
It is with sincere pleasure that German physicians place themselves in the service of this great patriotic endeavor, vowing to fulfill their duty with utmost loyalty as servants of our national health.
The entire membership file of the Nazi Party has been preserved in the German Federal Archive in Berlin, including many doctors. Today we know that precisely 3/4 of them were members of Nazi organizations. No other professional group was that active at such an early stage. What did the doctors hope to achieve through their support? Lecture halls were overflowing. Young doctors entering the field faced only unemployment. Established physicians complained of a crisis in medicine. So they put their hopes in the Nazi Party. It promised jobs and a new spirit to guide the medical profession. The picturesque village of Aldrese is in the Mecklenburg region of northern Germany. It was there on June 2nd, 1935, that the Nazis opened the leadership school for the German medical professions. Government radio broadcast live.
Jetzt naht vom neuen Gutshaus herüberkommend der Stellvertreter des Führers, begleitet von dem Reichsärzteführer Dr. Wagner, dem Reichsleiter Martin Bormann und den Angehörigen seines Stabes.
It was Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, who coined the programmatic slogan, "National Socialism is applied biology." 3 years after Hitler assumed power, doctors in Germany were trained here to apply the laws of nature to the national body as they interpreted them: heredity, breeding, selection, survival of the stronger. In Alt-Rese, they learned to serve the new German medicine as priestly doctors and health leaders. Wolfgang Coupe is a veterinarian and the former mayor of Alt-Rese. He knows the history of the village and its past, so long kept hidden. Course participants lived in these buildings as if at a training camp. They included general practitioners, specialists and professors, nurses and midwives. No one was to be left untouched by the new spirit.
Morgens halb 6 begann der
The day
Tag
started at
mit dem
5:30
Frühsport.
with early morning
Die
exercise.
Ärzte mussten morgens zum
The young
Sportplatz oder
doctors
zum
had to meet at the
Waldlauf in den
athletic
Park.
field or go for a
Dann
run
wurde
in the park.
gemeinsam Frühstück gegessen.
Afterwards, they would eat breakfast together,
Bettenbauen
make
schloss
their
sich
beds,
an.
and then classes
Und
started,
dann kamen die
either here in
Kurse,
the training center,
entweder
in the
hier
communal
in der
building,
Schulungsburg
or
im
outdoors.
Gemeinschaftshaus oder auch im Freien.
Many participants sneered at the organized merriment and the prescribed sense of national community. They were outraged at the loss of status that came from the sweeping use of the familiar form of address and felt like bellboys in their ridiculous uniforms. But the enforced camaraderie worked its poison. Chief Physician of the Reich, Gerhardt Vogner, proclaimed the new values.
Ein neues ärztliches Führertum hat inzwischen das Vergangene abgelöst. Es ist gegründet auf dem Fundament unserer nationalsozialistischen Weltanschauung. Inhalt und Träger der Nation ist im nationalsozialistischen Deutschland das deutsche Volk. Ihm hat der Arzt der Zukunft in erster Linie zu dienen.
The highlight of every training course were the ceremonial vows in the assembly hall.
We shall be honest, decent, loyal,
and comradely to members of our blood and to no one else.
Diese Schule diente dazu,
the school served to train the future leaders of the National Socialist Health Services, to motivate them, and of course to train them in eugenics, equip them to effectively carry out the euthanasia program, and of course also their duties in the concentration camps.
Eugenik und natürlich auch in Aufgaben der Konzentrationslager.
Dachau, Ravensbrück, and Auschwitz began to dominate the proceedings in Nuremberg. Did the defendants named by Telford Taylor have anything to do with these camps? Was it only a coincidence that Karl Brandt occupied the same seat as Hermann Goering had in the first Nuremberg trial? The aim of the medical trial, too, was to charge those who bore the main responsibility.
I will deal first with the military side.
Their functions are listed on the large organizational diagram of the Nazi Health Administration that Taylor had mounted in room 600 as a guide for the court.
The Supreme Command of the Armed Forces, better known by its German initials, OKW.
Karl Brandt's name was at the very center of the diagram. As Reich Commissioner for Health and Medical Services, called sanitation at Nuremberg, Brandt held the highest position, at least officially. He attached the greatest importance to the fact that he merely participated in National Socialist medicine as a kind of differential, according to a favorite image of his. In his diary, he wrote,
"On a sketch that is hanging in the courtroom like a danger sign, it looks as if I were a spider sitting in the center of its web."
How did Karl Brandt, a trained emergency surgeon, achieve this outstanding position? He recalled the day that changed his life. In August 1933, Karl Brandt traveled to Obersalzberg, Hitler's mountain retreat. Brandt had just turned 29 years old. Hitler had invited not Brandt, but the doctor's fiancée, Annie Rayborn, a German swimming champion. Hitler had seen her photograph in a magazine while he was serving time in prison for high treason. He first sent her a congratulatory note, followed by an invitation to come to Munich. Since that time, she had been a part of Hitler's closest circle. Her fiancé, Karl Brandt, was also welcome at Obersalzberg, where Hitler liked to hike with his guests. Like many before and after him, the young intern was enchanted by Hitler. August 15th, 1933 was to be a fateful day for Karl Brandt. Hitler's group of happy vacationers was going on an outing. Brandt noted simply in his prison diary,
"I was part of the group touring the region of Weitenwinkel when Hitler's personal adjutant, Wilhelm Bruckner, had a serious car accident. I operated on Bruckner and the others who were injured at a nearby hospital. Adolf Hitler asked me to assume their follow-up care. That is how I became more closely tied to Hitler as a physician."
Hitler enjoyed talking with someone like Brandt. He was medically competent, enthusiastic about National Socialism, intelligent, well-read, and cosmopolitan. Eva Braun also liked the doctor and often filmed him together with Hitler.
This developed into my later position as personal physician. Whenever Hitler went on extended trips, I was required to accompany him.
The surgeon now belonged to Hitler's innermost circle. He was almost always with him, following in the car behind Hitler's in case of a medical emergency. The two of them were also very close on a personal level. Hitler was a witness at Brandt's marriage, an exceptional honor. The Brandts were also invited to private celebrations at Hitler's mountain retreat, and the warm feelings were mutual.
I admired Hitler as a person more and more. Like most of the nation, I was convinced of his qualities as a leader.
dann wird das Ergebnis nicht die Bolschewisierung der Erde und damit das nicht die Blutung sein, sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa.
On April 1st, 1933, the Nazis called for a boycott of Jewish businesses. Jewish stores and doctors' offices were destroyed. Julius Streicher was one of the worst of the anti-Jewish rabble-rousers.
Wer selig geworden ist, der weiß, ohne Lösung der Judenfrage keine Erlösung der Menschheit.
On April 7th, 1933, the Nazis enacted the Law for the Restoration of the Professional Civil Service. The euphemistic title sounds harmless, but in reality, for non-Aryan, as well as communist citizens, it meant the end of their careers. The SA, or stormtroopers, arrested many Jewish physicians. Like Dr. Mamlock in this clip from an East German post-war movie, they were treated worse than criminals. Out of a sense of duty to their patients or personal courage, they had violated the ban on entering their hospitals and practices. This building is at 54A Werner Vossdam in Berlin, formerly named General Papa Straße. This used to be military barracks. Now it houses private residences. The residents know nothing about the sinister history of the building. But sculptor Rolf Schulz does. He knew there had been an SA torture chamber somewhere in the neighborhood. Someone who had lived there at the time helped him find it.
Erzählte mir, hätte eines Tages auch gesehen, dass Menschen
He told me he once saw people being locked up, and they called out their names and addresses to him. They asked him to notify their families. With that information, I came here the very next day with a flashlight. I searched the cellar for signs.
Mit einer Taschenlampe nach Zeichen.
On the walls, I found scratch marks, keeping track of the days, swastikas, and also a silhouette drawn of a Jewish prisoner.
Some of the people imprisoned here were neurologist Fritz Frankl, the physicians Max Lefkowitz, Kurt Goldstein, and Erich Simenauer. Simenauer later managed to flee Germany. He returned in 1956, one of the few to do so.
Bei Dr. Simenauer ist die Geschichte überliefert, dass in
Dr. Simenauer's story is that he was arrested in Moabit Hospital and then brought here.
Ein SA-Bewacher
An SA guard recognized him. Dr. Simenauer had recently removed the man's appendix. In gratitude, the guard wrote, "Don't mistreat," on the back of Simenauer's docket. Dr. Simenauer later said that had saved his life.
From March to December 1933, about 2,000 people were imprisoned, tortured, and beaten here. Many of them died. There were many other cellars like this one. A torrent of laws stripped Jewish doctors, such as Dr. Oskar Hirschberg, of their rights. Dr. Hirschberg was a medical officer of outstanding merit and a veteran of the First World War. First, his registration with the national health system was revoked. In effect, a financial death sentence. Then he was required to put a Star of David on his office sign and use Israel as a middle name to identify himself as a Jew. And he was allowed to treat only Jewish patients. About 9,000 Jewish doctors were forced into ruin. Most of them left the country. Very few managed to start over again after going abroad, and they were not welcome everywhere. Well-established and lucrative practices of Jewish doctors were taken over by non-Jews. Many were Aryanized, as it was called. The doctors were forced to sell the practices far below their value. For unemployed Nazi physicians, such an opportunity was the reward for their loyalty to Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Being forced to wear the yellow star was especially humiliating for the Jewish physicians. Being banned from practicing their profession drove many to acts of desperation. Professor Peter Voss-Winkel of Lübeck has researched many previously unknown life stories and discovered many famous and honored physicians.
Professor Hausmann war Pharmakologe und Lichtbiologe in Wien.
Professor Hausmann was a pharmacologist and biologist in Vienna.
Steht also bis heute nur, wäre 1938 gestorben.
He was also a senior ministerial official in the Austrian government.
Magistratsarchiv der Stadt Wien liest,
Published material said only that he died in 1938. Now it is possible to view the coroner's report in Vienna's municipal archives. It reads that on April 27, 1938, that is, 5 weeks after the Nazis annexed Austria, he committed suicide by hanging. This was a common fate. We easily found a dozen similar cases in the archives in Vienna. Those coroner's reports list sleeping pill overdose, barbiturate poisoning, here again sleeping pills, morphine overdose.
Voss-Winkel did research in 54 countries, examining thousands of documents in order to reconstruct the fate of doctors, not only Jewish ones, who had been persecuted. Most physicians managed to emigrate in time, but many were also killed. Dr. Victor Hammerschlag, 1943 in Theresienstadt. Dr. Erwin Klausner, 1944 in Auschwitz. Dr. Felix Riach, 1943. And Dr. Zygmunt Erben, 1942 in Theresienstadt. All of them were victims of the racial fanaticism of the Nazis. Karl Brandt was often at Hitler's side. It was never definitively proven whether or not he had ever been directly involved in anti-Jewish actions. Like many others, he claimed to know nothing about them. In his prison diary, Brandt wrote,
Adolf Hitler was always proper, benevolent, and friendly towards me.
Was that the reason he was in prison? Was the verdict of the U.S. tribunal clear from the outset?
Anyone who has been so long at Hitler's side must be a dirty swine.
Things could have been very different. Instead of standing trial as the chief defendant, he could have stood at an operating table in Africa, working alongside the idol of his youth.
While I was in medical school, I made contact with the famous doctor, Albert Schweitzer. I wanted to assist him in his medical work in Lambaréné in the French Congo after I completed my surgical training. But it became impossible for me to carry out my plan, since I would have had to serve in the French military service. So I joined the Nazi Party on January 27th, 1932.
His name can be found in the Nazi Party membership file in the Federal Archive in Berlin. According to his file, Karl Brandt had German blood. His occupation is listed as surgeon, with a secondary job in the Reich Chancellery as the personal physician of the Führer, and as the General Commissioner of the Führer for Health and Medical Services. He accompanied Hitler on all the Führer's travels, including this trip with Mussolini to the Eastern Front in the summer of 1942. As Hitler's personal physician, Brandt wore an SS uniform.
Military Tribunal 1.
In the Nuremberg medical trial, prosecutor Telford Taylor outlined the motives behind the actions of the Nazi doctors.
It is incumbent upon us to set forth with conspicuous clarity the ideas and motives which move these defendants to treat their fellow men as less than beasts. The perverse thoughts and distorted concepts which brought about these savageries are not dead. They cannot be killed by force of arms. They must not become a spreading cancer in the breast of humanity.
Those perverse thoughts and distorted concepts that ultimately led to the tribunal evolved not in neighborhood bars, but in renowned scientific institutions. Especially in the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Genetics, and Eugenics, founded in Berlin's Dahlem district in 1927. Under the watchful eye of Athena, goddess of wisdom and skill, anthropologists researched human heredity. At first, they experimented on animals, in keeping with traditional ethics of science. Rabbits, which multiply quickly, were used to document laws of genetics and heredity. Hans Nachtsheim was enthusiastic in his research on rabbits. As director of reproductive research at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, he collected rabbits with birth defects. All rabbit breeders in Germany knew that. Each day, he received cratefuls of rabbits in the mail. Blind ones, deaf ones, epileptic ones. What Nachtsheim discovered using wild and domesticated animals, other race researchers applied to humans. The tasks of the new German medicine under National Socialism became to breed healthy Aryans, prevent the unhealthy from reproducing, and eradicate all those with hereditary diseases. So-called racial hygiene researchers at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute sought a formula for molding the new human being. Ottmar Baron von Verschuur's main area of research was twins, still a very interesting phenomenon for all geneticists. With twins, it is possible to examine which characteristics are hereditary and which are acquired or behavioral. Verschuur collected data on eye and hair color and measured bodies and skulls. His vision was to create the most extensive file on twins in the world. He was on friendly terms with his student, Josef Mengele, camp doctor at Auschwitz. Mengele also researched twins, taking advantage of the opportunities provided by the death factory. He was commissioned by the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute to select children to be used for research purposes. He killed them and sent the heads and eyes to Berlin. This has been confirmed by a delivery notice bearing Mengele's signature.
Es ist sicherlich von dem, was wir bislang über das Kaiser Wilhelm Institut
Of everything we know about the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology up to now, this is certainly the most extreme example of the integration of genetic research into criminal experimentation on humans. Verschuur ultimately admitted that he personally knew about at least the first shipment of eyes and had read the corresponding autopsy report.
Later, Verschuur denied ever having known anything. After the war, he received a university position as a geneticist in Münster. Eugen Fischer was the founding director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology. He had made a name for himself in scientific circles with a field study on the Rehoboth Basters, a people of mixed descent in German Southwest Africa, today's Namibia. His finding that so-called half-breeds were inferior humans brought him worldwide renown. In Germany, he was considered the supreme authority on race and became a leading Nazi ideologue.
Das Verhältnis zwischen Rassenforschern und den rassenpolitischen Institutionen des NS-Staates war ein ausgewogenes,
The relationship
wechselseitiges
between race
Verhältnis. Es war sehr
researchers and the
stark
Nazi institutions
geprägt
for
von
racial
der
policy
Selbsteinbindung
was
der
balanced and
Wissenschaftler
reciprocal.
in diese Rassenpolitik. Sie nahmen an verschiedenen Positionen
To a large extent, the
Expertenrollen
scientists
ein.
got involved in policy
Sie waren in
voluntarily.
Sachverständigenbeiräten, sie betätigten
They
sich
served on committees of
als
experts and as
Pädagogen
teachers
für
to
die
train staff in
Ausbildung
Nazi race
des
policies.
Personals in den Instanzen der NS-Rassenpolitik.
Fischer founded journals, published countless scientific studies, and co-authored a major work on human genetics, a standard textbook known simply by the authors' names as Bauer, Fischer, Lenz. Hitler copied long passages from the book. Fischer's racial doctrine was respected around the world. He maintained extensive contacts outside of Germany. The racist network was active internationally, even across the Atlantic. Eugen Fischer had a close friendship with U.S. race expert Charles Davenport. In 1910, Davenport founded the Eugenics Record Office, a kind of breed registry in Cold Spring Harbor, Long Island. Science historian and biologist Garland Allen examined the genealogies and questionnaires on heredity in the Cold Spring Harbor archives. The race researchers under Davenport saw the goal of their mission as improving the American gene pool.
Most of the early 20th century eugenicists in the United States were profoundly disturbed by what they saw as the social problems that were emerging in America's largest cities, Chicago, New York, particularly. And their intention was to try to help solve these problems by identifying their cause as a genetic biological problem rather than a problem caused by the way in which society was set up. So, for example, what they wanted to identify was people who they thought were genetically inferior and were, let's say, genetically predisposed to being alcoholics or genetically predisposed to being criminals, to identify those and to, in various ways, discourage or prevent them from reproducing.
Large segments of the population actively supported Davenport's research and donated funds to finance summer courses for amateur race researchers. Only very few of the field researchers had any scientific qualifications. Their notes and family trees were often based on nothing more than hearsay. Yet many Americans participated enthusiastically, sending in records of their descent and family traits and illnesses. Researching human breeds became a popular pastime in the United States.
At very visible gatherings like state fairs and what were called fitter family contests, families entered their pedigrees, their family histories, for being judged in the same way that farmers would enter the pedigrees of their prize bulls or their prize pigs for being judged for their hereditary and breeding quality. And those fit families were supposed to be the ones that led the reproduction of the next generation. The other distinguishing feature of the American movement was its emphasis on immigration restriction as a means of curtailing the influx of so-called defective germplasm to the United States. And there were pinpointing certain individual ethnic groups that were thought to have a large number of defective genes and wanting to restrict their immigration selectively over those that were coming from other countries and other ethnic groups.
The promised land of freedom and prosperity. Beginning in 1890, an increasing stream of immigrants headed for the New World. But before being allowed to enter paradise, they had to pass muster at Ellis Island. Many Southern Europeans and Jews from Eastern Europe thronged to enter the country. They were considered inferior and thus undesirable ethnic groups in the United States. In the registry room, they were questioned about their family history and any hereditary diseases. They underwent physical exams and IQ tests. The question that loomed in the background of all this was whether they would be useful to the United States. Access to the Promised Land was controlled by immigration authorities, following guidelines set by the eugenicists in Cold Spring Harbor. The so-called stairs of separation separated new citizens from human garbage, as the undesirables were openly called. They were sent back to where they came from.
After 1933, the American eugenicists were particularly both excited about and envious of the work that was going on in Germany because of the rapidity with which German eugenicists had been able to get legislation passed that had been so difficult and so time-consuming and laborious for the eugenicists here in the preceding decade. So there was a real admiration on the part of American eugenicists for what was going on in Germany, and reciprocally, the German eugenicists were very interested in and being able to point to the United States as having produced much legislation long before Germany ever had been able to do so.
Doubts about the work of the Eugenics Record Office started growing in the United States, and its funding was cut off in 1939. At the same time, in Germany, the concept of racial hygiene was wending inexorably towards its gruesome, macabre climax. At Berlin's Race Research Institute, the reputation of a German anthropologist was measured by the number of skeletons and skulls he collected. Dr. Wolfgang Abel was known in the scientific world, far beyond the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, as the so-called Negro expert. He too was obsessed with collecting skulls. The crates are marked IFR for the Institute for Race Biology. Inside are collections from Abel's institute, found in a basement in East Berlin. They contained hundreds of skulls, still in their original wrapping, newspapers from 1943. That was when Abel had them relocated so they wouldn't get damaged in the bombing. Abel had obtained many skulls, like this one from Rudolf Virchow's collection. The task of an anthropologist was originally to research the diversity and background of human beings. During the Third Reich, they began to distinguish superior from inferior races. Skull collectors became actual headhunters, who didn't shy even from murder. Telford Taylor exposed this horror to a stunned public.
What I will cover now comprehends the murders committed for so-called anthropological purposes. 112 Jews were selected for the purpose of completing a skeleton collection for the Reich University of Strasbourg. Their photographs and anthropological measurements were taken. Then they were killed. Thereafter, comparison tests, anatomical research, studies regarding race, pathological features of the body, form and size of the brain, and other tests were made. The bodies were sent to Strasbourg and defleshed.
Taylor presented photographs to the court as evidence. A Center for Nazi Race Studies was established at the Natural History Museum in Vienna. In 1939, a permanent exhibition on racial hygiene opened there to serve as propaganda for the so-called solution of the Jewish question. The anthropology department provided the pseudoscientific reasoning for the extermination of European Jewry. Today, the staff deals openly with the history of their institution. It is no longer treated as a taboo. Part of the exhibition still exists today, but it is available to be viewed only for legitimate purposes. Margit Berner explains the aim of the exhibition back then.
Diese Fotos stammen von der Wiener Kriminalpolizei.
These photographs were from the investigative division of the Vienna Police
von der
Department.
Abteilung angefordert und diese Ausstellung
The
hat
museum's
geheißen, das
anthropology
körperliche und
department
seelische
requested them in
Erscheinungsbild der Juden.
1939 for use in an exhibition
Dabei
entitled
wurde
The Physical
dann
and
versucht, praktisch
Psychological
anhand
Traits
dieser
of the Jews.
Fotos den Leuten
These photos were
vorzuführen,
used to
eine
try and prove that
quasi
Jews were biologically
biologische
different. An attempt was then made to substantiate the findings scientifically on the basis of standard typology.
Like rabbit breeders, Nazi scientists defined and distinguished different human races, including a so-called Jewish race, thereby fanning the already widespread flames of anti-Semitism. Nazi doctrine held that so-called inferior races, categorized as Eastern races, Middle Eastern races, and Oriental races, had spread throughout all of Europe in order to threaten the Aryan race. Their goal was to register and identify them in order to purge Europe of Jews. Statues from the 1939 exhibition are stored in the basement of the museum. They were prepared in the museum's own art studio, based on photographs and plaster casts labeled Jew, Negro, Kafir, or Moluccan. The dazzling counterpoint to the race exhibition were the ideal Aryans, as the Nazi regime hoped to breed them.
Schädellänge 15,9. Jochbeinbreite 11,2.
This excerpt is from the propaganda film, Who Belongs to Whom?
Frau Weber 1C. Herr Weber. Haarfarbe Kuh. Ich danke Ihnen. Wir sind fertig.
Was it really possible to use calipers, eye charts, and nose comparisons to determine who was a Jew, or a quarter Jew, or even a Geltungsjude, that is, anyone declared Jewish under the Nazi race laws? Did the racial evaluations of Nazi anthropologists have anything at all to do with science?
Ein solches Gutachten beruhte auf der damals gänglichen, freilich völlig
Such reports were based on the totally harmless form of paternity reports, which were very common at the time. The mother was examined, the father, an additional respondent, maybe even a third one, and the children. Individual features were scrutinized to see how similar they were within this family group. There's nothing wrong with that. It's something that everyone might do in everyday experience. Except that here, it was done systematically.
Dass diese Merkmale jetzt ganz plötzlich verwendet werden,
But these reports had an additional element. The characteristics were then suddenly used, without any scientific justification whatsoever, to say, this nose is Jewish, this mouth is Jewish, or this cheekbone is Aryan. On top of that, the report started with the examination of, say, Mr. Emil L. The family names are omitted. The report was sent back to Berlin, and the next step was that this man was no longer named Emil L., but Emil Israel L. With that, the verdict had been pronounced. In other words, scientists were armchair criminals, sending people to the concentration camps by drastic, utter abuse of scientific method, deceiving themselves and the public.
In die Konzentrationslager geschickt.
The U.S. military court was not able to prosecute Karl Brandt for the mass extermination of Jews in Auschwitz. Yet he is linked to at least the prelude to the greatest crime in the history of humankind. The legend of a martyr was born, and Karl Brandt was part of it, under orders of the Führer. On November 7th, 1938, Brandt was called out of the operating room in Berlin. As Hitler's man for sensitive tasks, he was ordered to France. Herschel Grinspan, a Jew, had fired 5 bullets at Ernst vom Rath, a junior diplomat in the German legation in Paris. The Nazi press ran headlines saying, "Crimes of the international Jewish conspiracy," and "This will have consequences for the Jews." The attacker was apprehended. Vom Rath was operated on immediately and appeared out of danger. He was under good medical care in Paris. Why did Hitler send Magnus, an emergency surgeon, and Brandt, his personal physician, to Paris? The story suddenly took a surprise turn with the arrival of a telegram in Berlin.
My Führer, party comrade vom Rath succumbed to his bullet wounds on 9 November at 4:30 p.m. Signed, Brandt.
While Brandt was traveling back to Berlin, a suspiciously well-organized pogrom against the Jews was rapidly launched throughout the entire Reich. The night of November 9th, 1938 was dubbed Kristallnacht, for the sound of broken glass, as Jewish businesses were destroyed, synagogues set on fire, and Jews beaten and killed. It was the overture to the Holocaust. Starting in 1942, trains with millions of Jews rolled from all parts of Europe, bound for Auschwitz. Doctors were pioneers, paving the way for the Holocaust. They had defined the Jewish race, and they had written the racial reports that sent Jews to the extermination camps. Physicians stood on the ramp at Auschwitz. They picked out twins, dwarves, and gypsies for medical experiments. They tore families apart. Everyone had to appear before the doctor. Children under 14, all women, and the elderly were sent directly to the gas chambers. The examination lasted 2 or 3 seconds. Then the doctor pointed the way with his thumb. Doctors implemented the Nazis' fanatic racial policies, whether as executors or actual executioners. Doctors determined the dosage of the lethal gas. Doctors monitored the killing procedure. Doctors directed the stripping of corpses and the search for gold fillings in the teeth. Doctors were masters of life and death, sharing responsibility for the murder of millions. In the course of the trial, the full extent of the doctor's role in the Holocaust came to light. Telford Taylor said this about the defendant's responsibility.
Some of them may be sadists who killed and tortured for sport, but they are not all perverts. They are not ignorant men. Most of them are trained physicians, and some of them are distinguished scientists. Yet these defendants, all of whom were fully able to comprehend the nature of their acts, and most of whom were exceptionally qualified to form a moral and professional judgment in this respect, are responsible for wholesale murder and unspeakably cruel torture. German doctors were also sent to the Eastern occupied countries to assist in the mass extermination of Jews.
Then, on December 16th, 1946, a thunderbolt struck. Another defendant, Victor Brack, seriously incriminated Karl Brandt. He said Brandt had been responsible for actions in which Jews in Poland were exterminated. Up to then, Brandt had been convinced the Americans wouldn't dare to hang him. The new turn of events shocked him.
I have had a devastating day. Brack submitted an affidavit that is the biggest lie imaginable. This man said that the eradication of Jews in Poland was carried out with my approval. I have no witnesses, no documents, nothing. They are going to try to blame everything on me.
Brandt consistently admitted his responsibilities in the Department of Health, but said he had nothing to do with the murder of Jews. How would the court evaluate Brack's accusations? For Karl Brandt, it was a matter of life and death. Physicians have committed themselves to helping the sick and abstaining from whatever is harmful and mischievous. Yet under the dictatorship of Adolf Hitler, doctors recast themselves as murderers, claiming to serve the Volkskörper, or national body. In 1945, the Allies liberated the Nazi concentration camps, as well as many places classed as sanitariums or mental hospitals. The unimaginable horrors perpetrated by the Third Reich were revealed to the world. Worse yet, doctors had participated in some of the most gruesome atrocities. The medical profession had been among the most willing of Hitler's accomplices. In 1946, some of those doctors went on trial in Nuremberg for war crimes and crimes against humanity. One of them was Karl Brandt. Brandt's newly examined prison diaries reveal details of the path that ultimately led him to the centers of power, making him a familiar figure at Hitler's side as the Führer's personal physician. Karl Brandt originally dreamed of being a missionary doctor, like his idol, Albert Schweitzer. Yet he ended up at the Nuremberg medical trial, answering for crimes against humanity.
Ich werde einer solchen Anklage meinetwillen nicht ausweichen.
Der Nürnberger Ärzteprozess bringt täglich neue Einzelheiten zum Thema Entartung und Missbrauch medizinischer Befugnisse im Dritten Reich. Die amerikanische Anklagevertretung unter Führung von General Telford Taylor setzte die Beweisaufnahme fort. Der Fall jedes der Angeklagten, 22 Männer und einer Frau, wird durch dokumentarisches Material und durch Zeugenvernehmungen bis ins Kleinste geprüft und geklärt.
In the main courtroom, an American military tribunal is prosecuting the Nazi doctors for crimes against humanity, including human experimentation. The most serious charge is euthanasia, the murder of hundreds of thousands of helpless victims. After the indictment is read, Judge Walter Beals asks each of the accused to enter a plea.
Your name is Karl Brandt?
Jawohl.
Have you entered your plea not guilty to this indictment? And do you now plead not guilty?
Ich erkläre jetzt auch nicht schuldig.
Karl Brandt was the lead defendant. He was Hitler's commissioner for health and medical services and, if convicted, he would face the death penalty. Brandt believed he was in prison for other reasons. He felt he had been condemned before the fact, for being a part of Hitler's inner circles since he was a young doctor. In his diary, he noted what people probably thought.
Anyone who has been so long at Hitler's side must be a dirty swine.
He is reported to have once said to his friend Albert Speer that he would be hanged if it ever became known what he had done. Yet in his diary he appeared confident.
The Americans wouldn't dare to hang me.
For 10 years, Brandt was the Führer's private physician, always at Hitler's side. In and of itself, that was not a crime. Nor was it a crime when Brandt became General Commissioner for Health and Medical Services by decree of Hitler in 1942. But that made him the highest-ranking medical functionary in the Nazi regime. And for that, he had to stand trial. Brandt's rival was Dr. Leonardo Conti, a committed Nazi from day one who was the party's health leader for the Reich. It was Conti's responsibility to reform the medical system, reorganizing it in the spirit of National Socialism.
Die Gedankengänge und wissenschaftlichen und politischen Erkenntnisse der Erbgesundheitspflege und der Rassenpflege mussten für uns die Grundlage unseres Denkens und Handelns auch auf dem Gebiet der Pflege der Volksgesundheit sein. Diese ideenmäßige Umbildung war noch keineswegs restlos vollzogen.
In a frenzy of reform, the Nazis planned to completely reinvent healthcare. No area of life would be exempt from these changes.
Was wir roh essen können, sollen wir auch roh verzehren, weil dann alle wertvollen Bestandteile der Früchte, Salate, Gemüse und Wurzeln unverfälscht von uns aufgenommen und zum Nutzen des Körpers und der Gesundheit verarbeitet werden. Im Allgemeinen leiden wir an einer starken Überschätzung des Fleisches. Fleisch soll immer nur Zukost sein. Von ganz besonderem Wert ist unser täglich Brot, so wie es uns neuerdings aus echtem Schrot und Korn überall angeboten wird.
Whole grain bread turns your cheeks red, went the saying at the time. A campaign was also launched against stimulants.
Ein solches Leben ist Gift für die Gesundheit. Wer gesund bleiben will, muss auch gesund leben.
In order to maintain the health of the German people and keep them fit for work, smokers were examined prophylactically for lung cancer, an extremely progressive move by Nazi doctors. At the start of the 20th century, cancer had become the #1 killer. The search had begun for carcinogenic industrial and environmental pollutants. Lung cancer and tobacco consumption. German pathologist Eberhard Scheicher had established the connection as early as 1943. Perhaps the first to say, smoking may be hazardous to your health. Robert Procter teaches the history of science at Pennsylvania State University. He has a theory on why the Nazis dedicated so much energy to investigating cancer, even founding an institute for tobacco research, and why they banned smoking in the workplace and in public.
I characterize the Nazi regime as having a kind of homeopathic paranoia, a fear of very tiny, insidious agents eroding the folk body from within or from without. And the anti-cancer campaign really has to be understood as part of this same campaign of paranoia, fear that Jews were eroding the body, that cancerous agents were eroding the body, agents like lead or asbestos or tobacco. And so I think this ideology of a fear of agents poisoning the body is really central to understanding the anti-cancer campaign.
A flood of anti-smoking propaganda warned of the dangers of the tar and tobacco and demonized cigarettes as a product of Jud Zeus, or Jew Zeus, an anti-Semitic caricature used by the Nazis. But Procter says there was also serious research behind the racial paranoia.
Well, we really have this one image of science in Nazi Germany, and that's of Mengele and of Auschwitz and the medical experiments. And what I think is important to realize is that through this same motivating racial fanaticism that gives us Mengele, we also have this strong anti-tobacco research that ultimately produced this very solid world-class science that even today stands as one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century. But was that good? It's certainly good technical research. It's done in the Nazi regime, and in a sense, it's being produced in the Nazi regime actually ends up hurting that science, covering it up, hiding it. People today don't even know that the Nazis did that kind of research.
Under the National Socialist regime, many public health policies were, in fact, quite progressive. But the real goal of medical research was to preserve and promote what was called the productivity of the people. Under the Nazis, health was no longer a private matter.
Heute mehr denn je haben wir die Pflicht, gesund zu sein und gesund zu leben.
It was all part of the master plan for victory. Germany's future was to be shaped by the belief that a healthy nation is a strong nation, is an invincible nation. Throughout the Reich, 700 public health departments had been set up since 1934. Their task was to maintain racial hygiene. That is, to ensure a totally healthy nation of Aryans. One positive side effect of this was comprehensive health care.
So wurden durch die NSV in jeder Stadt und fast in jedem deutschen Dorf Hilfsstellen Mutter und Kind eingerichtet. Ihre Zahl ist bis heute auf über 29.000 angewachsen. Hier erhalten werdende und junge Mütter unter ärztlicher Aufsicht Rat und Hilfe.
Nationalized healthcare and financial incentives helped drive up the birth rate. Hitler knew that his battle for world domination could not be won without a steady supply of healthy young Germans.
So, Walter, jetzt wollen wir mal schauen, was hier fehlt, ja? Mach mal schön auf.
Nun nehmt mal eure Zahnbürste und macht mal alle mit. Tüchtig, von oben bis unten, rechts, links. So, jetzt wollen wir mal tüchtig gurgeln.
Even today, mass vaccination is recognized as the least expensive method for preventing epidemics of disease.
Und du? Heinz Kocher.
Na, du bist doch tapfer.
Wie heißt du? Hertha Schroth.
Oh, wir beide kennen uns doch.
Mhm. Na und du? Annie Meyer.
To stem the further spread of tuberculosis, which was rampant, mass X-ray screening was instituted throughout the German Reich, using high-powered modern machines.
Ein Apparat für Reihenuntersuchung mit 250 Röntgenaufnahmen in der Stunde.
The national body was subjected to assembly line X-ray examination. In a horrifying perversion of their normal role, doctors proposed registering and then eradicating all Poles and Jews who had TB. The Nazi medical establishment's answer to the spread of infection was not to cure patients, but to exterminate them.
Alle erfassten Volksgenossen, auch die Rückwanderer und Umsiedler, sind in dieser Kartothek sorgfältig registriert.
Statistics became an integral part of the job of keeping the national body in shape. The doctor's new motto was, keep count and keep files. In 1939, the process of amassing information on everyone in the Reich began. Using a then state-of-the-art punch card system, a health registry was established of the entire German population. Public health authorities collected data and counted. Included in their statistics were the number of Jews suffering from tuberculosis or typhus, people referred to as asocials, and those without fixed abode, and all the Romany people, called gypsies in the registry, 85,000 of whom were ultimately murdered. All patients in sanitariums and psychiatric hospitals were registered, and those who were unfit to work were culled. More than 250,000 of them were murdered. Thousands upon thousands of cards, each one representing a victim. The SS also used punch cards to efficiently organize the Holocaust, as envisioned by Reich health leader Leonardo Conti.
Der Schicksalsweg der Völker kennt keinen Stillstand. Er kennt nur Aufstieg oder Niedergang. Ein Volk muss Hammer oder Amboss sein. Der Wert des Blutes, der Wert der Rasse entscheidet.
Conti escaped trial by committing suicide in his cell in Nuremberg, leaving Karl Brandt the main person called to account for the crimes of Nazi medical policy. The prosecution submitted this organizational diagram of the Third Reich health system, based on a sketch made by Brandt. Although he placed himself at the center of the diagram, he saw himself not as responsible, but simply as the coordinator of the machinery. Brandt had decided to testify in his own defense, and on February 3, 1947, he was sworn in. Brandt was aware that he was facing the death penalty for the charges connected with the Nazis' so-called euthanasia program, in which hundreds of thousands of the disabled, mentally ill, or simply elderly were murdered. Knowing the prosecution would hold him responsible for that, he wrote extensively about euthanasia.
The more clarity, thoroughness, and rigor brought to bear on the program to prevent children with hereditary disease from being conceived in the first place, the less we will have to deal with the whole problem of euthanasia.
In other words, Brandt said in his defense that if forced sterilization had begun earlier and been more thorough, he would not be on trial now. In order to create images of ideal humans like these children, doctors called for immediate compulsory sterilization of 10 million people. There was extensive propaganda for so-called positive eugenics, according to which only healthy Aryans should be allowed to reproduce. Like this poster, which reads, "Healthy parents mean healthy children." But doctors were also deeply involved in the darker side of eugenics. This meant forced sterilization of anyone considered inferior, and there was no lack of propaganda for that. The fabled village idiot was to be erased from public life. A hate campaign flourished, such as this poster, which tells Germans, "You pay the burden for hereditary disease." Propaganda films showed only the most severe cases to appeal to a sense of pity.
Müssen über 700 Millionen Mark jährlich für solche Unglücklichen aufgebracht werden.
Nicht dieses Opfer allein. Tiefstes Mitleid mit dem unbarmherzigen Schicksal jener Menschen erschüttert unser Herz und gebietet, die Fortpflanzung dieser Unglücklichen mit allen Mitteln zu verhindern.
A law for the prevention of genetically diseased offspring went into force in July of 1933, mandating that anyone who was by heredity mentally deficient, physically disabled, epileptic, blind, or deaf be forcibly sterilized, even, as the law expressly stated, against the will of the sterilization subject.
The goal of the Nazi sterilization measures was to improve the genetic attributes, what we would call today the gene pool, of the German people. That kind of thinking is no longer seriously pursued in Western democracies. Today, the question of whether or not a child with genetic flaws is born, assuming you know beforehand, is up to the mother or the parents.
Because of its Nazi history, prenatal diagnostics and genetic manipulation are highly controversial issues in modern-day Germany.
The unavoidable question, however, is whether women experience latent, subtle pressure not to bring children with genetic flaws into the world. The basic question is whether our current practice leads to a kind of eugenics through the back door.
Beginning in January of 1934, the district court in the Thuringian city of Altenburg was the seat of what was called a hereditary health court, one of 200 such courts in the German Reich. The law was considered a basic law of the Reich, and it triggered an unbelievable flood of reports on candidates for forced sterilization. A judge and 2 doctors ruled on each of the applications for sterilization that flowed in from the local public health offices. All healthcare professionals were required to report candidates for sterilization. There was almost no resistance, since nobody wanted to seem backward. The courts complained of log jams in processing the petitions. Rolf Thurm was one of those reported to the court because of a congenital bone deformity. As a good student, it was a hard blow for him when the Nazis forced him to drop out of high school. But they weren't finished with him yet.
Ich war 1937 15 Jahre alt.
I was 15 in 1937 when my parents and I received the summons from the Altenburg County authorities to appear at the public health office. Their job was to determine that I had a hereditary condition, and there was no arguing with them. It was a foregone conclusion that I was to be sterilized.
Often, those reported weren't even summoned to appear personally. Instead, the judges relied on doctors' reports and a so-called intelligence test that went something like this.
How many days in the week? What does a hundredweight of potatoes cost? When is the Führer's birthday? Name some rivers in France.
Questions like those provided no way of distinguishing a mere lack of information from a case of clinical mental retardation. Which was, in fact, irrelevant, since the more people who were sterilized, the better. Judgment was passed in 20 minutes. In reality, even before the alleged proceedings had even begun. The official diagnosis was always the same.
Hereditary defect confirmed. Failed tests of knowledge as well as independent thought.
And the official remedy was always the same.
The aforementioned subject shall be made infertile. If he refuses to appear voluntarily, the police are ordered to present him.
And so sentence was passed on 15-year-old Rolf Thurm.
At first, you really do feel inferior. There are a lot of things you can't participate in. You're like an outcast. That situation got a lot worse, too, after the sterilization. On top of it all, I couldn't get work, just because I was disabled. Not because I wasn't up to it mentally, but just because I was handicapped.
Rolf Thurm's fate was shared by 400,000 men and women. It was not until 1980 that the surviving victims of forced sterilization received a lump sum compensation of just 2,500 euros, and not before they had completed a humiliating application process. Since 1990, they get a small pension. This training film taught doctors how to efficiently perform the sterilizations. Vasectomies were performed on males in just a few minutes using a local anesthetic. Females required more complicated abdominal surgery under general anesthesia. Public hospitals vied to take part in the sterilization program. A medical facility that wasn't on the list was considered old-fashioned. The operation was a required part of the training to become a specialist, and different methods of sterilization became the subject of scientific research. The forced operations resulted in the death of 6,000 people, collateral damage that was accepted as a necessary evil. A lot of doctors tried to use the research to make a name for themselves. Some of them ended up in Nuremberg. They were charged with conducting sterilization experiments on humans in the concentration camps.
Military Tribunal 1 is now in session. From about March 1941 to about January 1945, sterilization experiments were conducted at the Auschwitz and Ravensbrück concentration camps and other places. The purpose of these experiments was to develop a method of sterilization which would be suitable for sterilizing millions of people with a minimum of time and effort.
When Auschwitz was liberated, the Nazi doctors' deadly capacity for inventive experiments came to light. Soviet doctors examined men who had been castrated. They had been called up to a counter, and their testicles were then bombarded with radiation, secretly. The building called Block 10 in Auschwitz was the scene of these crimes. In keeping with the Nazi gift for euphemism, it was innocuously called the Surgical Department for Prisoners. But this was not a place for the treatment of disease. It was the site of clinical mass murder. The Nazi doctors requisitioned Jews as well as Gypsies deported from all over Europe to fill the wards. There, they were subjected to horrific medical experiments. They were castrated, starved to death according to a precise schedule, and deliberately infected with typhoid fever, typhus, and other diseases. Many of the victims were women. Caustic substances were injected into the uterus or fallopian tubes, with devastating results. The doctors were searching for a quicker method of female sterilization to replace the lengthy operation. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, had plans to sterilize up to 30 million Slavs. Karl Clauberg, the chief experimenter in Block 10, wrote to Himmler that he had found a way of what he called treating 1,000 women a day.
Man hat uns Häftlinge in eine schmutzigen, verlausten Lager auf der Erde geschmissen. Man hat Frauen genommen, junge, 19-jährige, schöne Frauen, und war denen verschiedene gynäkologische Operationen.
Survivors later reported that Clauberg liked to choose attractive Greek women for his perverted experiments. Although Clauberg bore the main responsibility for the barbaric sterilization experiments in Auschwitz, he was not charged at Nuremberg. After spending several years in a Soviet prison, he returned to West Germany and was eventually arrested, but he died in prison before being brought to trial. However, dermatologist Adolf Pokorny was in the dock at Nuremberg.
As a result of Pokorny's suggestion, who had developed a method of sterilizing women based on the injection of an irritating solution, several thousand Jewesses and Gypsies were sterilized at Auschwitz by this method. Conversely,
Pokorny defended himself by claiming he had actually tried to undermine the sterilization program by advocating an ineffective method.
Das Gericht in Nürnberg sagte dazu, wir sind von der Verteidigung, welche der Angeklagte vorgebracht hat, nicht beeindruckt. Und es fällt uns schwer zu glauben, dass er von hehren Vorhaben geleitet worden sei. Jedoch, wie dem auch sei, im Fall von Pokorny ist der Anklagevertretung nicht gelungen, den Beweis seiner Schuld zu erbringen. Wir erklären daher, dass der Angeklagte freigesprochen wird, nicht wegen, sondern trotz der Verteidigung, die er vorgebracht hat.
February 3rd, 1947, was the day Karl Brandt had spent months preparing for. The day he would take the stand to be cross-examined by Telford Taylor.
The execution of the so-called euthanasia program on the German Reich, in the course of which the defendants herein murdered hundreds of thousands of human beings, including nationals of German-occupied countries. This program involved the systematic and secret execution of the aged, insane, incurably ill, of deformed children and other persons by gas, lethal injections, and divers other means.
Karl Brandt was being held accountable for the euthanasia charge. As the court and the public waited to see how he would defend himself against the charge, they were in for a surprise.
Habe ich die Euthanasie bejaht? Ich erkenne das Problem wohl. Es ist so alt wie der Mensch. Aber es ist kein Verbrechen gegen den Menschen und keines gegen die Menschlichkeit.
As early as the 1920s, many doctors had called for permission to kill lives unworthy of living, as the Nazis called the disabled. Karl Brandt was not the only one to believe that euthanasia was the way to release incurables from their suffering. In response to the charge, he wrote,
"Euthanasia is nothing more than a higher degree of humanity, the highest level of human ethics, the strongest expression of the affirmation of life."
Brandt's first involvement with euthanasia began as an alleged humanitarian mission. In addition to being Hitler's personal physician, Brandt had become the Führer's man for sensitive assignments. One of those began in the spring of 1939.
Adolf Hitler received the files of a child who was born blind and missing one arm and one leg. The father appealed to Hitler for euthanasia for the child, whereupon Adolf Hitler sent me immediately to Leipzig.
The child, referred to only by an initial as Child K, was under treatment at the university's pediatric clinic. The doctor in charge had prompted the parents to ask Hitler for a mercy killing for the child.
I was charged with establishing the facts for myself, and if the reports proved to be true, I was authorized to tell the doctors on Hitler's behalf that they could perform euthanasia.
Many doctors had been waiting for years for Hitler to approve euthanasia. The Führer had always said to wait until the war started, which by 1939 was clearly on the horizon. The application from Leipzig presented an excellent opportunity to launch Aktion Gnadentod, or Operation Mercy Killing. Brandt saw right away that the child was, in fact, severely disabled, both physically and mentally.
The parents were not to get the impression that they had initiated it. So, in keeping with my instructions from Hitler, I authorized the doctors to present the death of the child as if it had resulted from other causes. I was also instructed to make sure there could be no legal repercussions.
Brandt instructed the senior doctor accordingly and made it clear to him that it had to look like death of natural causes. After completing the task Hitler had given him, Brandt told the father of Child K that the so-called mercy killing would be granted. The father later reported,
"That was how Mr. Brandt explained it to me. We told him how extremely grateful we were. He was a proud man, intelligent, very convincing. To us, he seemed like a savior."
Child K died on July 25, 1939. The autopsy report lists the cause of death as cardiac insufficiency. In other words, a weak heart.
In gewisser Weise kann man sagen, dass diese Episode
In some way, you could say that the incident with child K triggered child euthanasia, as well as adult euthanasia.
Gab. Ich denke, in diesem Zusammenhang sind zwei
Two things are important to consider here.
Zum einen wurde
First of all, the case of child K was what got Hitler's chancellery involved,
denn der Brief
since the father's letter was addressed to the chancellery.
Adressiert. Es ist von daher kein Zufall, dass später
so it's no accident that later the Führer's chancellery was at the center of euthanasia planning.
Euthanasie stand. Der zweite Punkt, der wichtig ist,
the second thing that's important is that the case of child K also got Karl Brandt involved.
Von daher ist es natürlich auch
so
kein Zufall,
it's also no
dass Karl
accident
Brandt
that Hitler
dann
later gave
später
Brandt the
von
task
Hitler
of
den
overseeing euthanasia.
Euthanasieauftrag erhielt.
The Führer's chancellery was here, in this building on Berlin's Wilhelmstrasse. It was the cover address for everything to do with euthanasia. Less well known is that films were also produced here. A film crew had been working since 1940 on a top-secret project for the Reich. It was initiated at the urging of high-level medical functionaries, among others. The working title of the planned propaganda film was Existence Without Life. The filmmakers were told to use pitiable cases of disability to suggest to the German public that mercy killings were a humanitarian obligation, and to prepare doctors and other caregivers for the murder of their charges. The unedited footage from the film project has survived. Cases like this one, which bears an astonishing resemblance to Leipzig's Child K, were intended to show the German people that clinics and mental hospitals were overcrowded with the incurably sick. Doctors cooperated enthusiastically in the filming. They were particularly interested in getting rid of the hopeless cases in their clinics. Psychiatrists called openly for what they referred to as ballast lives, to be moved to what the Nazis euphemistically termed facilities for the dying, claiming that psychiatry would otherwise end up on the margins of science. All over the Reich, cases of people with especially glaring deformities were gathered together. Their deaths were then deferred until the film crew arrived. Josef Goebbels, Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, had personally ordered that only convincing cases be filmed to make for more effective propaganda. The film crew were professionals. Using simple tricks of lighting, they turned the unfortunate sick into demonic beasts and monsters. In addition to light and shadow, they also used other film tricks to manipulate the public. Here, using a text he was probably forced to learn, a schizophrenic man pronounces his own death sentence.
Ich hab gesagt, erschießen sollen Sie mich. Erschießen Sie? Ja. Warum nicht? Dass ich weg bin von der Welt. Ja, warum sollen Sie mich erschießen? Was selbstverständlich. Was denn? Das habe ich ja schon gesagt. Was haben Sie gemacht denn? Mein... mit die Kirche. Haben Sie da Schmerzen gehabt? Haben Sie Schmerzen? Wo? Nein, Schmerzen? Schmerzen, ja, Schmerzen, die, dass ich unheilbar bin. Unheilbar? Ja, ja. Darum wollen Sie weg? Darum will ich weg von der Welt, ja.
The filmmakers and the authorities who commissioned the film appeared satisfied after viewing a rough cut. But Hitler allegedly had the film banned. Perhaps he was afraid that the pictures would actually evoke sympathy among the public. Perhaps he expected resistance to the so-called Operation Mercy Killing. For doctors in the Third Reich, it was not enough just to bring an end to existences without life. Anybody deemed useless to the Nazi state because they were unable to work and it cost money to keep them alive was slated to be killed, and many were. The murder of the sick began in 1939 under a tight veil of secrecy. This is Baumgartner Heights, the psychiatric hospital of the city of Vienna. Since 1907, doctors had been treating the mentally ill here in magnificent Art Nouveau buildings surrounded by lush landscapes. At the time, that was part of the philosophy of progressive psychiatry. That is, until Nazi doctors took over the hospital and set up a pediatric specialty clinic. The new unit, however, was not set up for treatment or even long-term care, but for murder, the murder of children. But it did not stop with their deaths. The bodies of the murdered children served research purposes. Pathologist Julius Hallervorden said,
"Look, if you're going to kill these people, at least remove their brains, so the material can be further exploited. And the more, the better." Of course, I was eager to take possession of the brains. The whole thing was fabulous.
So they preserved and collected and forgot. Inquiries from relatives of the dead were always answered with a lie. We no longer have any of that material in our possession. Herwig Czech works for the archives of the Austrian resistance movement. He identified some of what the Nazi doctors left behind: tissue samples, brains and bone marrow from almost 600 children. The plan is to inter them in a special memorial grave. The files offer proof of how the bureaucrats of death went about their grisly work.
Here I have an example of a case from the unit. On the cover you see the name, when the child was admitted, and date of death. This is the admission sheet, along with photos taken at admission. Then we have the personal data. Not only those of the child, but also of family members were noted in detail. Finally, the examinations and observations made on the wards were channeled into a report to the health authorities, or to the Reich Committee for the Scientific Registration of Severe Hereditary and Constitutional Illness. That was the cover organization within the Führer's chancellery, which was entrusted with carrying out euthanasia on children. There was a panel of assessors on this committee that decided if the child would live or die purely on the basis of the information in the report. The committee would then give authorization for the killing to the clinic in Vienna, where it would be carried out by doctors and other staff. The final weeks and days of those children are documented in their files. Generally, they died from pneumonia, induced through massive overdoses of sleeping pills.
This is the entrance to the former newborn station, Building 15. This is where the Reich Committee children, as the hospital staff called them, were sent. They were examined, observed for a while, and photographed for the files. Before being killed, some of the children were filmed for a training film. This child's name was Valentina. For the relatives of the murdered, the autopsy log from the pediatric clinic is a horrifying document.
Es war 1997. Meine Mutter ist verstorben.
In 1997, my mother died, and I found a picture among her things.
Ein Bild, was mich sehr berührt hat. Das
The
Bild
picture
zeigt
touched me
meine Mutter,
immensely.
meinen
It showed my
jüngeren,
mother, my
verstorbenen
late younger brother,
und
and my older brother.
meinen älteren Bruder. Ich bin 1947
I was born in
geboren und habe den Bruder
1947,
nicht gekannt,
and I
den
never knew that
Verstorbenen,
brother,
und
the
habe
older
in den
one who
Unterlagen
died.
meiner Mutter zu suchen begonnen. Und mir ist die Sterbeurkunde in die Hände
I began
gefallen
looking
und
through my mother's papers.
wie ich die gelesen habe, war ich elektrisiert.
I
Hier
found the
steht
death certificate,
gestorben,
and
Dezember
when I read it,
42
I
in
was
Wien auf der
electrified.
Baumgartnerhöhe.
It said,
Und
died in December
ich kannte in den
1942
Medien
at
die
Baumgartner
Diskussionen,
Heights.
habe sie verfolgt, aber nicht
I was
als
aware of the debate
Betroffener.
in the media.
Und
I had been
jetzt bin
following
ich dieser
it,
Sache
but I
nachgegangen,
didn't think it had anything to do
begonnen
with
zu
me.
recherchieren. Die Krankengeschichte
I started
zeigt
looking into it, doing research.
Untersuchungen und
The
was
medical
mich sehr
records
berührt
list
hat,
examinations,
dass meine Mutter offensichtlich versucht
and
hat,
something
ihn
that really touched me.
wieder herauszuholen.
My mother apparently tried to get him out.
abgeholt, aber einige
He
Tage
was picked up,
später
but then
wieder
readmitted a few days later.
ein Foto befindet sich in dieser Krankengeschichte.
There's a photograph in the records taken the second time he was
am
admitted to
Tag
the
der
clinic.
zweiten Einlieferung
That picture shows a
aufgenommen
sweet,
worden ist.
normal,
Dieses
completely
Foto
intimidated
zeigt ein
child being held up to the camera.
liebes, normales,
That photo moved me immensely.
vollständig verschüchtertes Kind, welches in eine Kamera gehalten wird. Und dieses Foto hat mich also unglaublich berührt. Vorher
An
heißt
entry
eine
before that
Eintragung
says,
an
infected with tonsillar diphtheria.
erkrankt. Und es
And it
dürfte
must have been shortly after
kurze
that,
Zeit später
I can't imagine anything else,
ein,
that the death
ich
sentence
kann
was
mir nicht anders
pronounced.
vorstellen, Todesurteil gefällt worden sein.
There's an entry here that says he was put in isolation.
Man sieht bei dem
The autopsy
Sektionsprotokoll,
report, which was
welches
apparently
am
written
Tag
just
nach dem
one day
Tod
after his death, says,
offensichtlich schon
the body of a
geschrieben worden
boy,
ist,
80 centimeters long, no
Leiche
abnormality
eines
detected
80
on
Zentimeter
tonsils.
langen Knaben,
And I have to ask,
Rache ohne
how can that
Befund,
be
ich
with
frage.
tonsillar diphtheria?
Und das bei Rachendiphtherie.
By 1945, almost 6,000 children had been murdered in the 37 pediatric specialty clinics of the German Reich. For the doctors of the Third Reich, it was not a crime, just part of the routine eradication procedures. In the basement of the pathology department in Vienna, a plaque commemorates the campaign of killing the sick and disabled. Even after their death, the children from the Vienna hospital were further abused as human raw material for medical studies. Under cover of the Reich Committee for the Scientific Registration of Severe Hereditary and Constitutional Illness, the pathologists preserved in formaldehyde the objects they used in their studies. For instance, the head of 10-year-old Anna Hofer. The worksheet says, "Keep for Dr. Gross."
Die Gehirne der Spiegelgrundopfer wurden über das Kriegsende
The
hinaus
brains of the
aufbewahrt,
victims of the pediatric unit were kept
Heinrich
preserved even
begann
after the end of the
Anfang der
war.
50er Jahre mit der
In the
Auswertung
early
der Gehirne jener
1950s,
Kinder,
Heinrich
an
Himmler
deren
began
Tötung er während
evaluating
des
the brains
Krieges
of children,
selbst beteiligt war, zum
some of
Teil.
whose murders he'd participated in during the
Das
war.
Ergebnis dieser Arbeiten
The
war eine
result of
ganze
his
Reihe
studies
von
was a series of articles on neuropathology.
Publikationen,
He published about 3 dozen or
bis
so
Ende
by the
der 70er Jahre
1970s,
erschienen,
sometimes
zum Teil mit,
co-written with other authors.
verschiedenen Mitautoren,
That work contributed to
den
cementing
Ruf von
Heinrich Gross's
Gross als
reputation
einen
as one of the most
prominentesten
prominent
Neuropsychiater
neuropsychiatrists in
Österreichs
Austria,
mitbegründeten.
In 1968, he got his own research institute, which also focused largely on this collection of brains. Then, in the mid-1970s, Friedrich Savreil, a former inmate in the pediatric clinic, recognized him. Gross tried to use his power as an expert witness for the courts to get Savreil locked up, so he couldn't testify against him. Luckily, he didn't succeed. The public dispute that followed that scandal involved a libel suit, which Heinrich Gross lost. With that verdict, it was also proven in minute detail that he had participated in killing the children.
He has never been prosecuted. The proceedings were suspended because he was judged unfit for trial. In the memorial chapel in the pediatric clinic are 579 urns containing remains of the victims of Vienna's child euthanasia program. Today, we know the names of each of those children. Giving them back their identities has been an attempt to restore to them some dignity and to allow them to finally rest in peace. 4 of them were Elfriede, age 10, Hertha, age 10, Otto, age 12, Reinhard, age 10. On the witness stand at the Nuremberg medical trial, Karl Brandt claimed,
"I was not closely involved in the organization of child euthanasia. That was under the purview of the Health Department in the Reich's Interior Ministry."
But the court had been provided with proof to the contrary. Documents show that until 1942, Brandt was the head of the committee. For the prosecution, that made him responsible for the killings. Brandt testified that,
"All I did was make sure the files were complete. It was not I, but the ministry that ordered the transfers to the institutions."
The question was how the court would evaluate the testimony of the main defendant. There was a recess for deliberations in the Nuremberg medical trial. Of all the Nazi doctors on trial here, it was Karl Brandt who held the highest position in the hierarchy. For him, it was a question of life and death. And yet he did not deny the accusations and continued to support the idea of euthanasia. He had come a long way. As a young doctor, he had already become part of Hitler's innermost circle at Obersalzberg. As the Führer's personal physician, he often had intimate conversations with him. But, he asked in his prison diary, is someone a dirty swine simply because they spent so much time with Hitler? Long forgotten were the pleasant memories of Easter gatherings at Hitler's mountain retreat. The question before the court at Nuremberg and before the court of world opinion was, how could this charming and likable man become a murderer? Physicians have committed themselves to helping the sick and abstaining from whatever is harmful and mischievous. Yet under the dictatorship of Adolf Hitler, doctors recast themselves as murderers, claiming to serve the Volkskörper, or national body. In 1945, the Allies liberated the Nazi concentration camps, as well as many places classed as sanitariums or mental hospitals. The unimaginable horrors perpetrated by the Third Reich were revealed to the world. Worse yet, doctors had participated in some of the most gruesome atrocities. The medical profession had been among the most willing of Hitler's accomplices. In 1946, some of those doctors went on trial in Nuremberg for war crimes and crimes against humanity. One of them was Karl Brandt. Brandt's newly examined prison diaries reveal details of the path that ultimately led him to the centers of power, making him a familiar figure at Hitler's side as the Führer's personal physician. Karl Brandt originally dreamed of being a missionary doctor, like his idol, Albert Schweitzer. Yet he ended up at the Nuremberg medical trial, answering for crimes against humanity.
Ich werde einer solchen Anklage meinetwillen nicht ausweichen.
In December of 1946, the U.S. military tribunal in Nuremberg opened proceedings against 23 doctors and functionaries of the Third Reich, charging them with crimes against humanity.
Military Tribunal 1 is now in session. The defendants will be seated.
Chief prosecutor was Brigadier General Telford Taylor.
Between September 1939 and April 1945, the defendants Karl Brandt, Blome, Brock, and Houghton committed war crimes as defined by Article 2 of Control Council Law Number 10, the execution of the so-called euthanasia program of the German Reich, in the course of which the defendants herein murdered hundreds of thousands of human beings, including nationals of German-occupied countries.
Karl Brandt was the principal defendant and stood accused as the architect of the Nazis' so-called euthanasia program.
Habe ich Euthanasie bejaht. Ich erkenne das Problem wohl. Es ist so alt wie der Mensch. Aber es ist kein Verbrechen gegen den Menschen und keines gegen die Menschlichkeit.
The tribunal saw it differently. In support of its charges, the prosecution presented film footage shot by U.S. soldiers in the spring of 1945, when they liberated the mental hospital at Hadamar. American forensic doctors examined the institution's few survivors. In keeping with Nazi policy, the patients, deemed hopelessly insane or feeble-minded, had been neglected and often left starving to suffer a drawn-out, painful death. The Americans discovered mass graves containing fresh corpses, proof that the killings had gone on until the very end. Karl Brandt claimed that these killings had nothing to do with the concept of euthanasia as he saw it. His prison cell became his office, the floor a filing cabinet. He spent long hours preparing his defense against the euthanasia charges.
Euthanasia is not mass murder, but an act of mercy. It is nothing more than a higher degree of humanity. Euthanasia is the strongest expression of the affirmation of life.
In his prison diary, he noted how Hitler had assigned him a special task that took him in early 1940 to Brandenburg in northern Germany.
In the fall of 1939, I was accompanying Adolf Hitler at his Obersalzberg retreat. He informed me that he wanted to solve the euthanasia problem once and for all.
Brandt's back was covered by a letter from Hitler, which gave Brandt and Philipp Buhler, a leading Nazi Party official, explicit instructions to expand the authority of doctors to allow them to implement what the letter called mercy killings of the incurably ill. At a former prison in Brandenburg, they sought the most effective way of implementing the order. At the time, Brandt was considered a conscientious doctor. He felt personally responsible and sought the most humane way to carry out the killings. He met with other experts for an official meeting that participants later described as a test killing. Also present was the Reich health leader, Dr. Leonardo Conti, who at the time was still the highest-ranking medical official within the regime. Two of the participants later testified under oath about what happened.
There were differences of opinion about the best method to use. Brandt took the view that euthanasia was a medical task and that a medical procedure had to be used, that is, death by injection. At that time, we were specifically told that Dr. Conti and Dr. Brandt would be administering the injections themselves, as a symbolic expression of the fact that, as the highest-ranking doctors in the Reich, they were to directly carry out the task for the Führer. Dr. Brandt was the one who wanted a test killing. The first test injections were given to a group of 6 patients. Dr. Conti and Dr. Brandt administered them. But the patients died very slowly. Some of them didn't die at all. They even began to thrash around.
The doctors were horrified. They had to administer repeat injections until all the patients were dead. They decided to experiment with other methods of killing the patients. Christian Wirth was a police detective and later an expert in gassing techniques at the extermination camps. He had a room converted into a shower.
A group of about 10 mentally ill patients was used for the first attempts at gassing to death with carbon monoxide. It was arranged by Dr. Brandt. He was a very conscientious man who took his responsibilities very seriously.
The gas chamber disguised as a shower room, the stripping of the corpses for gold teeth and other valuables, a doctor supervising the killing. It was all just as it would be later in Auschwitz. The eagerly awaited test results confirmed success. Brandt is reported to have later said that they died with a smile on their faces. He recommended to Hitler that gas be used for the medical killing. But Brandt was quite clear that only doctors be permitted to start the flow of gas. Brandenburg may well have been the model for Auschwitz, where carbon monoxide was replaced by Zyklon B. Brandt later claimed that he first heard of the poisonous gas used in the camps in a 1946 newspaper article. This bronze slab in Berlin reads, "In honor of the forgotten victims." It reminds us that it was here that the Nazis organized their first mass murder of 200,000 defenseless people. The campaign was designated Operation T4 after the address of this building, number 4 Tiergartenstraße. The harmless abbreviation was both code and cover for the systematic murder of patients in hospitals and nursing homes. Officials from the Führer's chancellery organized transport of the victims, billing the costs to health insurance providers and charitable organizations. That was the only reason files were kept centrally at T4 headquarters. 30,000 of the files are still stored in a federal archive in Berlin. After a journey through basements and bunkers, they resurfaced after the collapse of East Germany. The infamous East German State Security Police, the Stasi, had kept them in hopes of using them to incriminate West German doctors. Historians are now sifting through the files. They hope to learn as much as they can about the victims and to put names to them. Most of the murdered remain unknown. The files in the T4 clearinghouse noted whether a patient was fit to work or not. The so-called mercy killings were not reserved just for clinically hopeless cases, but also for useless eaters, meaning the deaf, the blind, and people with even minor disabilities. Many of these were children. Each medical history card is further evidence of an utter disdain for human life, carefully filed away.
Sie wurden dann in Berlin in der T4-Zentrale kopiert.
The files were copied at T4 headquarters in Berlin and then went to 3 different reviewers. Each file folder contained 150 records. The reviewers decided the fate of the patients solely on the basis of these reporting forms, without ever having seen the patient. The patients were then taken away in the notorious grey buses, either directly to the killing facility or sometimes to an interim facility where they were held until capacity opened up in the killing facility. It sounds very technical and bureaucratic, but that was the reality of the killing system back then. You could almost call it an industrial process.
Postal buses with the windows painted over were used to transport the disabled from the psychiatric hospitals to the locations where they would be gassed. Although the doomed patients scratched the windows to peek out, they never knew their final destination. However, many may have suspected, and some knew, that it was a journey from which they would not return. To one of the killing facilities at Grafeneck, Hadamar, or here, Bernburg, on the Saal River. The former death wing here has been preserved. The killings followed the same routine no matter where they were carried out. After the war, nurses testified.
The eradication procedure began as soon as the patients arrived. First, they were given a morphine injection. Since some of them started to get very excited, they were told it was a vaccination. Then they were examined to come up with a plausible cause of death and to see if they had any gold in their teeth. Then they were shoved into the gas chambers. The door was closed, and a doctor turned on the gas.
One of the doctors used to joke that they were already starting to topple. It was all over in 20 minutes. Later, doctors would claim that the victims passed away peacefully. One nurse testified.
I often cleaned out the gas chamber. It was usually covered in excrement and vomit. You can hardly claim that people who shit themselves out of mortal fear passed away peacefully.
There were 6 killing facilities scattered around the Reich. The one at Hartheim Castle, near Linz in Austria, was in operation right up to liberation. Everybody knew what was going on there. One of the villagers secretly photographed it. Smoke rose from the chimney of the crematorium day and night. The victims were first gathered together in the courtyard. It was the beginning of the path to death, first for the disabled, later for sick inmates of the concentration camps and prisoners of war unfit to work. The villagers called the former seat of nobility simply the murder castle.
We've been able to reconstruct about 23,000 names from the approximately 30,000 we estimate were victims in Hartheim. We worked largely from the transport lists from the institutions they came from.
Only a few years ago, pits were found on the castle grounds filled with ashes from the crematorium. Archaeologists are cataloging items found in the pits. These items, often the only possessions of those who were murdered, were rejected as being of no value to the T4 administrators. The scientists often feel emotionally moved when processing the finds. They refer to their work as victim archaeology. Their findings provide proof that the killing machine at Hartheim was in operation right up until liberation. No patient went to his or her death without a final bit of paperwork. In each of the killing facilities, there was a special department to write letters of consolation. Secretaries used boilerplate texts to compose notifications to the bereaved families. They inserted causes of death that were difficult to disprove, like meningitis, neuritis, or swelling of the brain. The diagnoses were made up by the doctors who did the gassing. On paper, murder became death of natural causes. In claiming that it was all perfectly legal, Brandt referred to Hitler's orders.
How could I expect that a decree from the head of state would dictate criminal behavior? It also turned out that everybody everywhere was doing the same thing, as if everything was in order. And for us, everything was in order.
Karl Brandt wusste natürlich, dass der
Karl Brandt knew, of course, that the murder of the sick wasn't legal, even by the standards of the Third Reich. All of the people who were responsible knew that. I'll give you two examples to illustrate. The Official Penal Code Commission ruled in 1935 that destroying life unworthy of living should remain a punishable offense. The Führer's Chancellery, which was responsible for the euthanasia program, requested those commission minutes in August of 1939, that is to say, before the euthanasia started. So they knew. As a second example, there was a detailed discussion in 1940 about a euthanasia law. Some of those responsible for the program weren't satisfied by the pseudo-legitimization through Hitler's decree. I consider it out of the question that Karl Brandt heard nothing about those revealing discussions.
Today, euthanasia is again a subject of public discussion. It is no longer a taboo subject in the Netherlands. In fact, since 2001, it has been regulated by law. However, it's not euthanasia as the Nazis practiced it, but assisted suicide. It is not a license to kill, since the patient has no legal right to demand assisted suicide, nor are doctors required to grant such a request. In Germany, the misuse of the term euthanasia by the Nazis has permanently distorted it and rendered debate on assisted suicide extremely difficult.
What was practiced under the Nazis in the name of euthanasia basically had nothing to do with that term. It was plain and simply murder. People were killed because of their physical state. They weren't asked. It was not free will. They were quite simply and maliciously murdered. So we have to distinguish between what was practiced under the name euthanasia during the Nazi period and what is practiced under that name today in the Netherlands, Belgium, and some US states. The principal motivation for the regulations in the Netherlands is to do justice to the will of the patient right up to the end of his or her life. The idea is for the patients to decide how they want to die, and that might include, as it explicitly does in the Netherlands, assisted suicide.
As long as it is strictly regulated, assisted suicide can mean relief for a patient. Euthanasia in the Third Reich had nothing to do with our current understanding of assisted suicide. But even then, its legality was questioned, and it was met with some opposition. In Nuremberg, Karl Brandt spent weeks honing his closing statement. He wanted to convince the tribunal that he had never lost the ideals of the young surgeon he once was. In an ironic twist, a well-known opponent of euthanasia became one of his most important defense witnesses, albeit in absentia.
Was it not Pastor Bodelschwing who said as recently as last year that I was an idealist and not a criminal? How could he have said that?
In February of 1941, Karl Brandt, as Hitler's top man for euthanasia, went to Bethel near Bielefeld to see Pastor Friedrich von Bodelschwingh. Often called the secret bishop of the Reich, the pastor ran the internationally renowned charitable institutions for epileptics and the mentally ill that his father had founded. Bodelschwingh prepared well for his meeting with Brandt. He was determined to protect the lives of his children, as he called the patients, in the Bethel institution. He had repeatedly refused to fill out the forms sent from Berlin, knowing that they meant a death sentence for the patients. Thus far, he had managed to stall for time. Now he wanted to use Christian ethics in his attempt to convince Brandt. Brandt went to Bethel to intimidate Bodelschwingh, to try and get him to turn over his patients for euthanasia. There was an intense discussion between the two men.
Als ich in jener Zeit mit Pastor Bodelschwingh, dem einzigen ernsthaften Warner, der mir persönlich bekannt wurde und begegnete, sprach, da schien es zuerst, wie wenn unsere Gedanken weit voneinander stünden. Aber je länger wir sprachen und je offener wir dabei wurden, umso näher und enger wurde unser gegenseitiges Verstehen.
The pastor pointed out that euthanasia was forbidden under Reich law. He also brought the argument that Bethel Institution was so well known that any action there would attract attention worldwide. Bodelschwingh gave Brandt a tour of the institution to show that his patients were not at all unworthy of living, but actually happy and content. Many of them worked, making them useful members of society. All of them were well and lovingly cared for. Was the pastor able to touch Karl Brandt's soul?
As we can tell from Bodelschwingh's notes, Brandt was impressed, particularly by the most severely disabled children he saw in Patmos House. He later brought up the subject again with Bodelschwingh. So in that sense, yes, you can say that Bodelschwingh touched something in his soul.
Karl Brandt allowed mercy to prevail for Bodelschwingh's patients. He ruled that euthanasia would be used at Bethel only for those patients in whom life is completely extinguished, as Brandt put it. With a heavy heart, Bodelschwingh made an unusual deal. He was allowed to keep his children. In return, he was required to turn over the most severe cases. He called them the flotsam of creation, and all Jewish patients.
So the claim that was circulated repeatedly after the war, that none of the patients from Bodelschwingh institutions went to their deaths, is not entirely correct. What is correct is that the bulk of the patients here were spared from euthanasia, and that resistance by the Bodelschwingh institutions noticeably slowed the euthanasia campaign here in the West, and thus saved people's lives.
Bodelschwingh later called it the hardest struggle of his life. Brandt called it struggling and searching. The two men continued to correspond. And Bodelschwingh said at one point,
Brandt is aware of the problematic nature of it. He acted not out of brutality, but out of a kind of idealism.
Brandt's act of mercy extended only to the institution at Bethel.
Brandt
also supported the elimination of mentally ill people who couldn't work. There's a memo that, by the way, was never seen by prosecutors in Nuremberg. The memo is headed, Decision of the two euthanasia officials with regard to evaluation of cases. The two euthanasia officials can only be Buhler and Brandt. Item 1 of that memo calls for the elimination of anyone incapable of performing productive work, whether institutionalized or not.
Auch nur in Anstalten produktive Arbeit zu leisten, also nicht nur
So it was not just those who were severely retarded. In other words, Brandt and Buhler were arguing in favor of eliminating the mentally ill who were unfit for work. This was not about relieving the suffering of the incurably ill.
war hier nicht die Rede.
Here, in the Westphalian city of Münster, the so-called medical killings were an open secret. The town's population anxiously awaited a word from their brave and fearless Catholic bishop. And indeed, on August 3rd, 1941, Bishop Clemens Count von Galen delivered from the pulpit a ringing condemnation of euthanasia and Nazi officials. When the Lion of Westphalia, as he was known, took the pulpit in St. Lambert's Church, the pews were packed.
In today's Gospel, we read of a distressing event. Jesus, the Son of God, wept.
Galen preached that Christians should shun the deadly events being perpetrated from Berlin.
Thou shalt not kill. This commandment from God our Lord, the only master of life and death, has been engraved on the hearts of humans from the dawn of time.
It was an explosive sermon, and one that the Gestapo recorded carefully.
At no time, and under no circumstances whatsoever, may a man, except in war and in lawful defense, take the life of an innocent person. That includes so-called life unworthy of living.
The daring sermon in Münster had far-reaching repercussions. Hitler heard about it while at the Eastern Front. The Führer wanted to avoid unrest on the home front. So on August 28, 1941, he ordered his personal physician, Karl Brandt, traveling with him as usual, to stop the euthanasia. However, smoke continued to rise from the crematoria in the killing facilities. The killings were no longer centrally organized from Berlin. Instead, the murders were ordered at the discretion of the individual doctors at the institutions. Now they themselves had become masters of life and death. One example was the hospital at Hadamar.
In der zweiten Phase sah die
During Phase 2, it was the responsibility of the doctors. Actually, I have to use the singular. There was only one doctor left here, Senior Surgeon Adolf Wollmann. He would confer with the head nurses on the morning shift and decide which patients should not be permitted to survive another night.
Welche Patienten die kommende Nacht nicht mehr überleben sollten.
Then, one of the night nurses would administer the patients the drugs, the overdoses of sedatives.
Den Patienten entsprechend Medikamente, also Überdosen dieser Beruhigungsmittel.
American officers arrive at a Nazi institution seized by First Army troops. Under the guise of an insane asylum, this has been the headquarters for the systematic murder of 35,000 Poles, Russians, and Germans sent here mainly for political and religious considerations. Those still alive are examined by Major Hermann Bolker of the American War Crimes Investigation Team. The townspeople in Hadamar, Germany, called this place the House of Shudders.
The hospital director, Dr. Wallmann, and his chief nurse, Karl Willing, were arrested and then interrogated by American investigators. Both men admitted killing patients with morphine. The investigators were also told that Wallmann allegedly threw a staff party to celebrate the death of victim number 10,000. He told the officers he had hidden the death registries in the wine cellar. They were found to contain thousands of names. The remains of the victims were exhumed. Many of them had not yet begun to decompose, meaning that the murders had continued at Hadamar until the Americans arrived in the spring of 1945.
The execution of the so-called euthanasia program involved the systematic and secret execution.
The central question facing the tribunal at the Nuremberg medical trial was whether there could have been any legal basis for the so-called euthanasia. Karl Brandt pursued a dual strategy in his defense. He claimed that he considered Hitler's euthanasia orders to be law. Almost nobody doubted that. The U.S. military tribunal had a letter from Hitler which explicitly stated that Brandt and Reich leader Buhler were charged with the responsibility of authorizing selected doctors to accord mercy killings to certain patients after a critical assessment of their condition. Just in case, however, Brandt also claimed,
I had nothing to do with the actual implementation of euthanasia. That was Buhler and Braque. Aside from that, I had completely other tasks beginning in August of 1941.
The old military overcoat hanging in his cell reminded him that he traveled frequently, starting in the summer of 1941, first within the Reich, then to all fronts.
Following the winter campaign in Russia, the Führer sent me along the road from Smolensk to Moscow, where there were numerous wounded who were reportedly left entirely without medical care.
Hitler had decided that Brandt should take care of it, and in the winter of 1941, the doctor flew to the Eastern Front under the Führer's special orders. A press photographer was there to shoot pictures of the mission that had brought Hitler's very own doctor to the forward battle lines. The first winter saw a dramatic breakdown of medical care and supplies for the wounded on the Eastern Front. Brandt was to come up with suggestions for better organizing transport of the injured back home. But he did not want to stand idly by. He was an enthusiastic and highly skilled surgeon, and he helped out wherever he could. That was apparently what he enjoyed best. It made him feel he was in his element. Military doctors later told the court,
I never met a medical officer who could equal Professor Brandt, either as a person or as a doctor. And Dr. Brandt always behaved in an honorable, humane way.
In order to provide better care for the injured soldiers, Brandt demanded that the Air Force, headed by Hermann Göring, provide transport back to the Reich for many more wounded than it had thus far. But his efforts at the front, which he described in his prison diary, did not help mitigate his guilt in the eyes of the court. In fact, his great talent for organization incriminated him even further, since it proved that Brandt was capable of leadership tasks. In 1942, Hitler first appointed his personal doctor, General Commissioner for Health and Medical Services. Then, as his trust in Brandt grew, the Führer later expanded his portfolio. A decree from the Führer on September 5, 1943 put Brandt in charge of the coordination of medical or scientific research. It was a fateful decree because it meant that human experimentation now fell under his purview.
The prosecution's case relating to those crimes alleged to have been committed in the name of medical or scientific research. Before taking up these experiments one by one, let us look at them as a whole. Are they a heterogeneous list of horrors, or is there a common denominator for the whole group? A sort of rough pattern is apparent on the face of the indictment. The mustard gas and phosphorus burn experiments, as well as those relating to the healing value of sulfanilamide for wounds, can be related to air raid and battlefield medical problems.
Expert medical witness Dr. Leo Alexander brought a young Polish woman before the court. Barbaric wounds were deliberately inflicted on her in Ravensbrück concentration camp. The doctors were testing whether sulfur drugs would speed up the healing of the wounds. The result of the experiments for the victim are extensive scarring and lifelong pain. Another witness was called to identify the head of human experimentation at the camp, also on trial in Nuremberg. He was an internationally known sports doctor who had been in charge of medical services for the 1936 Olympics. His name was Karl Gebhardt, and he appeared unimpressed by the proceedings.
Ich lege also meine Infektionsart auseinander und führte den höchsten Sicherungswert ein, der in der Durchführung möglich war. Ich bin überzeugt, dass es keinen besseren Weg gab, an diese unglückliche verlangte Entzündungsgrenze heranzukommen mit Branderscheinungen, mit einer geringeren Gefährdung, als diese Versuchsanordnung darstellt.
Thousands of prisoners in the camps died as a result of senseless and agonizing experiments. After the liberation of Auschwitz, Soviet doctors examined survivors of the experiments. After the war, many of their tormentors were soon back at work as respectable doctors, but the victims remained severely traumatized and marked for life. What was called the Surgical Department for Prisoners in Auschwitz was in reality a cabinet of horrors, site of terrible medical experiments on humans. The Nazi doctors soothed their consciences by calling it research and not sadism. That was particularly true for this man, Dr. Josef Mengele, personification of the most horrific medical crimes at Auschwitz. He treated the subjects of his experiments almost tenderly, with a perverse kind of consideration. He told them to call him Uncle Pepe, until the experiments were finished, and he personally injected carbolic acid into their hearts. Mengele particularly liked experimenting with twins.
We used to get a high temperature, or we would become yellow, or we would be swollen altogether. We just couldn't stand on our legs, or would have a terrific headache or so forth. Of course, it was all inexplicable, and we wouldn't get any help. I mean, when we asked the eldest of the barrack to gather something to help us, she wouldn't give us. She would give nothing. On one occasion, I remember she gave to one of the experimented people a drug, and the next day, Dr. Mengele came in, and he found out it was a terrible. I mean, she was nearly fired, because he thought that his experiments had been interrupted or disturbed by it, by having given any drug. Therefore, we were very sick and we could get no help.
Mengele shared an interest in twins research with his mentor, Ottmar von Verschuer. Verschuer's department at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Human Genetics cooperated with the experimental laboratory at Auschwitz. In the search for new discoveries in genetics, they used Aryan children as well as twins from Auschwitz. Mengele called them his guinea pigs, and the concentration camp, the zoo. He sent the eyes and heads of dead prisoners from Auschwitz to Berlin, complete with packing slip. It was mail order murder. 2,800 twins were murdered in Auschwitz. Only 200 were alive at the liberation in 1945. 56 years later, the German scientific community finally extended them a long overdue official apology. 7 German Air Force doctors were also in the dock at Nuremberg for human experimentation. Telford Taylor explained the supposed rationale behind the armed forces experiments.
The therapeutic pattern outlined above is undoubtedly a valid one and explains why the Wehrmacht, and especially the German Air Force, was interested in and participated in these experiments.
Pilots were often able to survive being shot down, only to freeze to death in the ice-cold North Sea. Specialists in aviation medicine were looking for a way to avoid this. At Dachau concentration camp, they immersed prisoners in icy water and then tested methods of rewarming them.
There was ice floating on the top, and suddenly I was very cold. I was shivering, and my head began to hurt.
Schmerzen habe ich bekommen im Kopf und habe ich gehört,
then I heard something like a giant machine, an electric turbine going bzzz in my head.
So Unruhe.
It was very disturbing.
Meine Augen gleich, ich weiß nicht, wie soll ich das erzählen, meine Liebe.
Then my eyes.
Oh, Gottes Willen,
I don't know how to explain it.
Das heißt, wie soll ich?
Oh dear, my God.
Eine Augen links
I
gucken,
went sort
eine
of
Augen rechts
cross-eyed,
gucken und
and then
nachher ist
everything
da
went
ganz
black,
dunkel
and I
geworden
lost consciousness.
und bin ich zum Bewusstlos gekommen.
Dr. Sigmund Rascher, who led the experiments, did not survive the war to face prosecution. One of Hitler's miracle weapons was the jet fighter that could ascend to the stratosphere. German scientists needed to research how pilots flying in the death zone could withstand the drop in pressure. In barometric chambers, volunteer Air Force soldiers breathed air low in oxygen. Doctors observed them doing math problems and copying columns of numbers. Most of them couldn't hold out long enough to provide meaningful experimental results. So the doctors had the mobile pressure chamber moved to Dachau concentration camp. There, they could take the experiments much further. They later told the court they believed the subjects had been sentenced to death anyway. With that license to kill, the doctors were able to complete their series of experiments. Here, the subject is a Russian prisoner of war. Doctors called experiments that ended with the death of the subject final experiments. The bodies were then autopsied. Seven Air Force doctors were charged in Nuremberg. 3 of them received long prison sentences. 4 were acquitted. But what became of the man who headed the research project called Rescue from Great Altitudes, Professor Hubertus Strughold?
Aber was würde zum Beispiel passieren, wenn durch Beschuss die Sauerstoffatmung plötzlich unterbrochen wird? Oder
space operations, we face a complete novel problem never experienced before by man.
Strughold escaped prosecution and possibly death by hanging when American authorities brought him to the United States, where he is still honored as the father of space medicine.
This morning, Tribunal Number 1 has convened in order to hear statements by the defendants in person.
Es gibt ein Wort, das scheint sehr einfach. Befehlen. Und was an Ungeheuerlichem birgt es. Wie maßlos sind die Konflikte, die hinter dem Gehorchen sich verstecken. Beides darf mich, Gehorchen und Befehlen. Beides ist Verantwortung. Ich bin Arzt. Und vor meinem Gewissen steht diese Verantwortung als Verantwortlichkeit für Mensch und Leben. Nüchtern stellt die Anklage die Behauptung von Verbrechen und Mord dagegen und erhebt die Frage meiner Schuld. Ich werde einer solchen Anklage um meinetwillen nicht ausweichen. Als Mensch wie als Arzt.
Until the very end, Brandt said his conscience was clear. Would his closing statement save him from hanging? Or had he already been condemned from the outset? He worried that the court might think,
anyone who has been so long at Hitler's side must be a dirty swine.
It is a fact that for many years he was Hitler's personal physician, always at the Führer's side. In 1940, when France surrendered. At the Wolfschanze, Hitler's headquarters. At the front, with Hitler and Mussolini. There is little question that he enjoyed his closeness to Hitler.
Adolf Hitler was always proper, benevolent, and friendly toward me. He may even have been a soft person, but in any case, he had a good heart. But what good is the kindest heart on earth against the demons of the will?
Brandt was apparently confronted by the demons in his Führer in late 1944. After an argument over some medication, Hitler fired his physician. Hitler then accused Brandt of treason. In April of 1945, Brandt was on the run.
Hitler had me summarily court-martialed by the SS and sentenced to death. Hang the treasonous swine.
Escaping the gallows by a hair, he managed to make his way to Flensburg in northern Germany, where Karl Dönitz was playing head of the Nazi state as the Third Reich collapsed. Karl Brandt was taken prisoner by the British, along with the last die-hard Nazis. All he said about Hitler, whom he had once so admired, was, "He's a devil." On August 20th, 1947, Judge Beadles handed down Karl Brandt's sentence at Nuremberg.
Karl Brandt, Military Tribunal 1 has found and adjudged you guilty of war crimes, crimes against humanity, as charged under the indictment heretofore filed against you. For your said crimes, on which you have been and now stand convicted, Military Tribunal 1 sentences you, Karl Brandt, to death by hanging, and may God have mercy upon your soul. The officer of the guard will remove the defendant, Brandt.
6 additional defendants received the death sentence.
Military Tribunal 1 sentences you, Victor Brock, to death by hanging.
Hoven.
To death by hanging.
Mragowski.
To death by hanging.
Rudolf Brandt.
To death by hanging.
Sievers and Gebhardt.
To death by hanging, and may God have mercy on your soul. The officer of the guard will remove the defendant, Gebhardt.
Brandt and the others awaited execution in the prison for war criminals at Landsberg am Lech. "270 war criminals were executed here between 1945 and 1951 because they blindly obeyed their Führer, because they ignored fundamental tenets of human rights, because they perpetrated acts that the laws of civilized nations condemn as heinous crimes." The 7 doctors sentenced to death at the medical trial continued for months to hope for a pardon. In vain. They were executed on June 2nd, 1948. Karl Brandt once hoped to become a mission doctor like Albert Schweitzer. As a follower of Hitler, he became involved in the crimes of an unjust regime. He was the only one sentenced to death who knew the exact date of his execution ahead of time. He considered suicide and rejected the notion. He wrote to his son,
"I could have gone on my own, but I wouldn't, due to a sense of greater responsibility."
But where does greater responsibility begin if not to one's fellow humans? Did Brandt acknowledge the depth of his involvement or even his criminal guilt? The answer must be no. To the very end, he did not.